This is Oral Rehab Lecture 8, Part 1. Lecture 8 is an overview of amplification. It corresponds with Chapter 2 in the Scow and Nurbin book. It doesn't exactly align with it in all regards, but this lecture presentation and the Chapter 2 in the book, I think, provide a nice complementary introduction to most of the major issues of amplification. We probably will have at least 2 additional lectures like this in the amplification area, lectures 9 and 10 over the coming weeks. We're at the point in our consideration of oral rehabilitation where we are beginning to consider how is it that we, professionals that is to say, help people adapt to impaired communication, or how do we help them to adapt to the consequences of their impairment. And so generally said, we can talk about the variety of things that we can do. Fundamentally, we provide counseling. We talked a little bit about counseling, which can be as well as information and support and adjustment. A key feature in counseling that's going to be effective should include the significant other in the family units. If we're talking about an adult with adult onset hearing loss, that would be likely a spouse. If we're talking about a child, we're talking about the family or other primary caregivers. In addition to counseling, we can also provide supplementary training. And in the concept of training, that's when we provide somebody with supplementary and skills to compensate for their hearing loss. This might be in the range of getting better information from the visual channel, getting more information from the auditory channel through the use of auditory training, or in additionally provide them strategies for better and more assertive communication. So counseling certainly provides a degree of effectiveness, as does supplementary skills training. But far and away, the primary sort of area where in sort of modern times we help people with hearing impairment is by the provision of products that we could generally define in the category of amplification devices, which provide them with physical electroacoustic compensations for their sensory loss. And as I suggested in the previous slide, all three, counseling, supplementary skills, and amplification, the provision of amplification devices is the area of greatest activity. And Chapter 1 in your text provides a data that Scow himself had determined that shows that in the majority of audiologists are engaged in hearing aid fitting almost on a daily basis, and so hearing aid fitting is really one of the more important aspects of what audiologists do. So this brings us to a general definition here of what is amplification, and so I guess in general, anything that brings sound more effectively to the ear could be considered to be an amplifier. In this sense, amplifier could be electronic, as you've probably typically considered, or even an amplifier could be just simply acoustic. In part, we're also dealing now with sort of the evolution of amplification devices over time, and so we're obviously in a modern sort of computer era, and so therefore we would anticipate, and you would be correct in that anticipation, that modern day hearing aids involve the use of computers, and in fact they do sort of on almost all level. But what you also have to kind of remember, or consider at least, is that acoustic amplifiers have been around sort of for a long time and preceded modern hearing aids. Acoustic amplifiers worked by being a sort of an extension of the outer ear, by being a funnel to collect sound, and additionally by being a resonator, which is to say which focuses energy at certain key frequencies. Now, if you look at this guy here, couple things I want you to think about. This is not a hearing aid, but I want you to think about what this gentleman's task might have been. If you can see that there's like a little cushion here, which again is going to out this tube, and then up here, and then sort of back out to his ear somehow. I'm not sure exactly what the rig is doing, but if you have the sense that this is a big sound collector, a big I like these, by the way. That's kind of a nice touch. This guy was in around, if you can notice the uniform as well, was an airplane spotter in World War I. So in the 19 teens, so 1914, 15. So this guy would be sitting out in a field somewhere and would be listening for airplanes coming. And so these were sound collectors and to a certain extent sound resonators. I don't know how effective they were, but it certainly makes for a good picture, I think. This same concept of a wearable resonator was attempted in marketing a few years ago in something called ear glasses. I actually don't own a pair of these. I wish that I did, just because I think they'd just be neat to wear around. But and so here you kind of see the ear glasses in place. Sort of these are again not different than our airplane spotter, in the sense that this is an extension, if you will, of the outer ear and sort of collecting more sound. In principle, acoustically, the principle kind of holds. The look here on this young lady over here, with the clear plastic, you almost can't tell that she's wearing anything like that. And if you look at the pricing of these things, $8.99, 2 for $16. Now that's a real bargain right there. And again, this company really is no longer in business, or at least if you go to that website, the last time I checked, the fellow said that he's got other stuff in development. So, but in principle, this is it's a reasonable thing. If you don't believe me, take your hands and put them up to your ears, hold them behind your ears, and listen. Either listen to me or anything else that might be around you, and you'll notice that with your hands cupped behind your ears, in fact, it does change the sound that you're listening to, and in fact provides you with slightly more sound. It's just kind of tiring to go around with your hands behind your ears all the time. So, since the electronic era began, which is approximately wearable sort of electronic devices, was sometime around 1920-ish, thereabouts. So in this time period, then 1920 to present day, electronic devices have basically sort of taken over the marketplace, so to speak, for how do we help persons with amplification devices. As you would think, these devices to help people hear better, have been and continue to get better and better. And I think it's a very clear and an accurate statement to say that modern day hearing aids have never been better. And the function of modern and contemporary hearing aids is such that they are sophisticated from a user point of view. They are sophisticated from how a hearing aid professional, such as an audiologist, would be able to adjust them to provide the appropriate sort of response and fitting from a technical point of view. So technically, hearing aids have never been better than they are in present day. If we think about what are some general principles involved in amplification, again, number one, amplification is the primary tool in oral rehab. So it's what most everyone who has a hearing loss is going to be involved in getting a hearing aid at some point or another. So hearing aids are sort of the primary tool to help people minimize their hearing problems. Now, this one's a little trickier, and it's maybe hard for you to accept, but it is the case. Hearing amplification devices, and hearing aids are a subset of those, are always an incomplete and imperfect solution to a complex condition. Always is a strong word to use, and I'm reluctant to use it, but I feel pretty committed in the sense that there's very few people who are going to be completely happy, and in which cases the hearing aids will completely solve all of their problems. Again, when we think about all of the aspects of hearing impairment, we think of when does hearing impairment become a hearing problem. We've heard nothing but that it's complex, it's highly individualized, there's this heterogeneity concept at play as well. So hearing aid devices and amplification devices can only do so much. there's going to be some limitations. By the way, one of the major limitations is not really an attribute of the amplification device itself, but rather relates to the organic capacities of the person with the hearing loss. So the primary one is if a person has reduced speech understanding. So when we think about what are some things that are going to be a problem for people, if a person has reduced speech understanding, it almost doesn't matter what the hearing aid is. It's just simply the case that the hearing aid is going to be dropping an amplified signal into an inner ear that is very poor at processing it and converting that into an electrical code. So if we think about what some of the specific purposes of amplification are, number one, and I guess the most important one is to amplify speech to a level that's audible yet comfortable. So this is a very key concept in terms of thinking what amplification devices their job is, okay? Is to take speech and to put it in this range, add energy to it, so that the resultant amplified speech signal is audible. And that's requisite, because if you can't hear it, there's no point in having a hearing device if the energy is not audible to the person. But yet not put so much energy in there that the resulting signal, that is to say the input signal of speech plus the amplification factor provided by the amplification device, not so much that it's uncomfortable for the listener. Again, it's the case, and maybe you might remember this from your hearing science class, if you think back to the psychoacoustics characteristics. So I don't know if I presume that you covered it in psychoacoustics and hearing science, but for almost all people, the upper level of when sounds become uncomfortable is almost relatively the same regardless of what your level of hearing impairment may or may not be, which is to say that there's sort of an upper level of physical sounds, at which they become uncomfortable to the listener. And that value does not change with hearing impairment. If it did, this would not be an objection. But the problem is the ceiling, if you want to think about it that way, the ceiling of sound levels that we can tolerate is flat and fixed. And as we add sound to an input signal, we get closer and closer to the ceiling until, unfortunately, there's very little space between where we are and the ceiling, acoustically speaking. And that's the real challenge, is that most people with hearing impairment have a very reduced dynamic range. The range being the range from between audibility and where sounds become uncomfortably loud. You might ask a question, why are we interested in speech as the primary signal that we're interested in? And that's because speech is the most important acoustic event for humans, for most humans. Some people may have an interest in hearing non-speech sounds, such as music and other things, but generally said, speech has been the focus. And the consequence of this is that with speech as the focus, that means that there's been an emphasis then on the reproduction and the audibility of those frequencies that are most important to understanding speech, and in making sure that persons with hearing loss are able to maintain audibility. Again, if we go back, this is lecture 4 stuff, but that's why it was important, because we got to consider that without audibility, a person will not have much of an opportunity to understand speech. So audibility, generally said, is a requisite. There's other reasons why amplification would be used, somewhat subtler and something not as an intention, but part of it is to help localize sounds, to tell where sounds are coming from. That's an important sort of safety issue, I would think, and also one that helps with attention, to help in the detection of sounds. So again, the ability to hear sounds like alarms and things like that are certainly are important as well. To restore a range of loudness experience. So all of you and me, have this range of things that could be very soft to medium or comfortable, and then uncomfortable, loud and then uncomfortably loud. And as it turns out, people with hearing loss, particularly hearing loss in their inner ear, generally go from sort of not hearing stuff to things being almost too loud right away. So their loudness experience is significantly different. And if we're talking about a child, and we're talking about a child in the development of language stage, if the premise is auditory oral, which is to say one of the major focal issues for that child is the development of spoken language, that development of spoken language is going to be most optimal if a child has access to the acoustic cues of speech. And fundamentally, that's what amplification does. And so, with those purposes in mind, let's adjourn now to part two, and we'll talk about some of the actual components of hearing aids.